Thank you for coming this evening, this fine, almost summer evening. The heat has ebbed a bit, and from where I've come from, way, way, way up in the north of North Wisconsin, this is much more suitable to my what I'm acclimated to. So thank you for coming out this evening. My name's Tracy Chipman, and I am an oral storyteller and also an author, a writer. And I'm a somatics and yoga instructor, and my world sort of spins between or braids with these three threads. And we're going on a journey this evening. We're going to be exploring this book baby. How many of you have published a book before? Well, congratulations. It's no small thing, is it, to publish a book and put something out in the world, whatever the genre. And so I commend you, and thank you for coming and identifying yourself fellow authors. So I wrote this book. It was about 13 years in the making, or even, it depends on when you decide when things begin. And Fairfield, although this book doesn't feature Fairfield per se, it is filled with so many references, either spoken and identified in the book or just well known to me. So it's just an incredible pleasure to be offering a reading to this community and to you. I'm going to read. It'll be a mix of reading, and I'll sprinkle in some kind of story as well, setting the context for this book. And I might share a few kind of writer's moments around the creation of it, because I think it's such a unique thing, the way a book comes together. At least for me, it was a very non-linear, which is not a surprise. The book is very non-linear. Which can be very confusing for folks who like the good old line. This is more nonlinear, and the process of writing it was a very nonlinear process. So, and then we'll take some time after we close for some questions, and then, yeah, then we'll wrap things up. I don't anticipate going over an hour. So, of course, there's restrooms out that way and through that door. If you need to use the restroom, please go. Oh, hello, hello. Come on in, my dears. There's some chairs right there for you. So, one of the things that feels really important to do as we begin, as we arrive here in this place at this time, is to just literally take a moment of silence. Stamping your feet. Yeah. Wiggling your bum in the chair. Yeah. Feel yourself sitting back into that which supports you. Knowing the floor is supporting you, the chair is supporting you, gravity is supporting you. Feel free to close your eyes or soften the gaze and just come into this miraculous experience of your body. If that's comfortable, if it feels weird or awkward, that's cool too. Don't push it. Maybe you can feel the taste in your mouth or taste the taste in your mouth. You can feel your fingers resting, your hands resting on your body. Resting in your lap. Notice any sounds that you hear outside of your body and or in your body. Notice any aromas that you might smell. So here we are, and as it's comfortable, you can open the eyes, arriving back to this place. So this book, Borealis Mundi, Resting in Place, Loss, and grace actually began as an idea that I had in the dome. Imagine that. And it was a desire to communicate my love of certain places, geographic places in my life. And that was about 2008. So here we are years later. This book weaves with place. It weaves with the experience of loss. And it weaves with something I've called grace, which there's so many different ways you could look at it. And in the book, I refer to grace as just a sense of being a small part of a greater whole, a sense of mystery, being connected to mystery. And it felt important as an oral storyteller to actually share these stories in a written format so that they could travel a little further than what the spoken word can travel. So we're going to begin. Borealis Mundi is Latin for northern worlds. And I chose a Latin title specifically, not only for the poetry of it, but because Latin was historically not a mother tongue. It was a language that was of a hierarchy. It belonged to elite men, clergy, sovereigns. It was not spoken by the common people. So there's a kind of a intentional use of Latin as a reweaving it back into common vernacular. And the structure of the book is broken up into 4 geographic places. One of them is a place called Gad, which you have never, probably, it would be almost like a lottery ticket if you had ever heard of Gad. It is an unincorporated village in north central Wisconsin, and it is my ancestral home in many ways. And another place is that of Lake Superior, and the other is a reservoir lake that was a river, and still is a river, that they dammed up to create a reservoir during the logging boom. And in that creation of a lake, Lake Menomin, which is in western Wisconsin, northwestern Wisconsin, they desecrated and inundated sacred Ho-Chunk burial grounds in the process. And to date, no reparations or even acknowledgments of this have happened. And that's perhaps not a great surprise, but it feels important to speak that. And as we gather here in the land of the Meskwaki and the Sauk and the Oseti-Sakowin peoples, that is woven into these places as I move through the narrative. And then the 4th place is far from Wisconsin. It's Scotland. And so it felt important to give you that structure. And I will begin by sharing an opening quote. "Not knowing when the dawn will come, I open every door," by Emily Dickinson. I've dedicated this book to my ancestors. And when we think of ancestors, the common thought or relationship might be with your blood ancestors. And so I acknowledge my blood ancestors. And I also acknowledge what I call the land ancestors, the ancestors of the places that have claimed me, that I've been drawn to, that I've lived on, that I've walked on. And then the 3rd ancestor that I acknowledge are soul ancestors. I believe we have those that have departed, whether we knew them or whether they lived 500 years ago, but their lives impacted our life significantly. So I acknowledge what I call my soul ancestors. And knowing that these ancestors, your blood ancestors, the land ancestors, and one's soul ancestors are these beings that stand behind you. And that to me is a source of great comfort. And throughout this book, as I move through the landscape of loss, finding comfort, finding sanctuary was not only essential, but it became kind of part of the gift of these experiences of loss. And to think that my ancestors are there behind me, and to have a felt sense of that was a really robust support. Okay. So I'm going to read from one of the opening pieces. Also within this book, there are multiple forms that I work with. I work with essay. I work with journal entries. I work with poetry, and I work with prose. So this is a piece called Pole Star. Back to back with earth, crown of her head facing north, lying on the damp July grass in her grandparents' yard. In this twilight, she is 10, porous with curiosity and innocence, though much has been broken. Overhead, the wind churns, white pine needles conducting their gentle tree music into the shells of her ears. Breathing in the perfume of clover, the tang of cow manure enters along with the blue twilight. Breathing out, she softens, becomes still, listening. From the house, swells of laughter, the shuffle of cards, the crack of a beer can opening flows out to her. She smiles, hearing the clatter of hand-dried dishes being set back in cupboards, and the whine of beagles as their supper of kibble, gravy, and pot roast scraps is set down. She knows the white tips of their tails will be hoisted and wagging furiously. Across the red granite gravel road, she hears the cows lowing in Mr. Gallistel's barn. A surge of being at home, of an unspoken knowing of place, of north, hums through her veins, raising goose flesh on her skin. Gazing into the country sky, her pupils dilate, and more light comes in. She greets star by glinting star as they present themselves, every star singing its strange, singular melody. Her body opens and softens. Decades later, she would hear the stories that movement inside stars creates a vibration similar to a musical instrument. The bigger the star, the deeper the pitch. There is one star she knows by name. One star, a pinprick of light she knows as Polaris. She knows this northern pole star is part of the Little Dipper, Ursa Minor, the little bear. Polaris is a compass for those lost at sea and on land. From Polaris, her gaze softens taking in the expanse of sky. Each and every star a solar miracle, a story made of stories, telling stories. With the universe in her ears, she knows there are things she will never have words for. So, in the spring of 2009, just a little context, I was living here in Fairfield and felt that I would never leave. Like this, having lived West Coast, East Coast, overseas, Southwest, I felt home here. But sometimes life has other plans. And I got a call from my father in Milwaukee who said he was diagnosed with late-stage lung cancer. And I knew in my heart that he had no one in his life to support him in this journey that awaited him. And I knew that I felt called to show up. I felt this was not my obligation, but something else, something that's harder to explain, that this was for me. I really didn't know what I was getting into. Had I known, I may not have answered that call. But I began going back and forth between Fairfield and Milwaukee, and those of you that have been present to that process of caregiving, of bearing witness to the end of life of a parent, know that it's a powerful, mighty, sometimes challenging thing. And eventually I moved in with him. I rented out my little house in Fairfield. And so it was during that time that I was living with my dad, which was intense, living in the suburbs of Milwaukee. I don't really identify with suburban landscapes or places very well. In a small apartment with a dying man who was not really addressing, well, he was resisting, of course, right? And so I would take a few weekends off from time to time just to get real and go drive north. And I would often drive to my grandparents in Gad, because there I could sleep in the bed that I'd been sleeping in for decades. I could eat grandmother food, and I could pretend there was something normal about my life. One of those journeys, I went further north, and I drove up to Lake Superior. So this is a piece, just a short few paragraphs of a journal entry towards the end of the autumn. That moment driving north from Gad, from Milwaukee, from the crucible of Dad's end-of-life dance, I felt her from 30 miles away. She is magnificent. She led me to Mike. I am so grateful for this connection with Mother Superior. Often, especially when I'm struggling, I think about the lake, recalling that presence, knowing that lives in me. Lake Superior offers me meaning, a connection to something larger than my life drama playing out. And I can't wait to be with her again. Anyway, I write, on Saturday, I'll head closer to her and to Mike, who's this man I've started dating, started falling in love with at the strange time that my father's life is ending. And I'm going with him to a Halloween dance. And one of Wisconsin's favorite contrabands is playing. They're called Duck for the Oyster. And if you have ever done contra dancing, you know that Duck for the Oyster, or even in square dancing, is one of the moves. It's one of the dances. And this band is playing, and I think it's the same band that played at Michael Perry's wedding. Those of you that have ever read Michael Perry may remember that. So, for the past few weeks, I've been working on a costume in between the madness of clearing out my dad's apartment, because at this point he had passed. And I think I've pulled together all the right pieces for this costume. Samantha gave me a red mask she made, and I have an orange scarf and a yellow top and a funky green resale belt and a long sparkly blue skirt with electric blue tights that I bought in Edinburgh years earlier. I completely covered my pair of boots with purple glitter. And yes, I shall be a rainbow. It has been an intense year of rain and shine. I haven't told Mike yet, so I don't know what he's going as. We'll surprise each other. I have that butterfly feeling in my belly when I think of Mike. Not sure what's going to happen there, but time will tell. So that was just before Halloween. And a week later, I write in my journal, 6 days ago on Halloween, I drove north from Gad to Springbrook. I slipped into my lover's arms for an All Hallows Eve contra dance with Duck for the Oyster. That night, Mike and I were humming with hot, fresh promise. What a night. The best and most fucked up night ever. Time stopped on many levels at 12:43 a.m. on November 1st, on All Hallows Eve, the night when the veil between the worlds is thinnest. We were in bed. Mike's heart stopped. We were just falling asleep. We were falling in love. Now there is no plan. So, life had big plans for me. 5 weeks after my father passed away after his 6-month journey with lung cancer from decades and decades and decades of cigarette smoke, this promising love had a massive heart attack. And the full moon, or near full moon, spilled in through the window. So, my life cracked open, and I grieve for who I was that night, just before, because she is lost to me in some ways. But who's been found and who stands here now wouldn't really have it any other way, as effed up as that sounds. Right? It's complicated, but it's real. So this is part of the story. And in this, I reach out to a dear friend, and I'm not going to read this part, but it feels important to reference it. I reach out to a dear friend who's been following my journey with my father's end-of-life story, and because she was providing support and counseling, and it's none other than our own dear Ciel Backstrom. And there's words from Ciel as she offers me such wisdom that it really feels important to share this. So I am going to read it. I wasn't going to, but I will. So this is Ciel emailing me after I tell her what had happened that night. And she says, "It's interesting that you have been collecting stories to share for years. I'm a storyteller and I've done some folkloric work. And now you are living in the midst of a most profound story of your own. You implied at this point your ability to verbally express the story is still nebulous. But the picture you sketched for me is quite phenomenal. And I hope someday you will be able to write it and share it, if you feel to do so." As I mentioned, the image that comes to me when you spoke of everything coming full circle is the image of the serpent swallowing its own tail. I was thinking more about it and how you were saying that you shared your whole background with Mike and that he didn't share his with you. And it makes total sense, really, for the progression of the circle. Do you know what I mean? It seems to me that it was up to you to be the one to come forward and complete the circle. If he would have come forward, it may have pushed you back, and therefore the circle wouldn't have been able to close. Here's my impression, CL says. So you came forward, opened completely, the circle closed, and Mike's light had to fulfill its mission and was able to ascend. And maybe it was a healing not only for you and Mike, but perhaps you served as divine archetypes, and your experience together was assisting in a universal healing of collective consciousness, a truly divine event. And that part of you is still open. It'll be a part that never closes. And another thing that's so interesting and mythological about all this is that the closing and fusing of the circle all took place on All Hallows Eve, Samhain. And you were a rainbow. And your heart was open. All your chakras were probably open and enlivened and spinning. You were a pure rainbow energy body. And when you think of all the things a rainbow symbolizes, it's pretty amazing. So, that's one storyline that is woven. And here in this section of Gad is also the storyline of my relationship with my grandparents. So take a deep breath. Yeah. And so a little context. So years pass. I would not return to Fairfield as I thought I might after my dad passed away. After Mike died, I couldn't come back. I couldn't come back here to a place where nobody knew him, where he'd never been. I needed to be as close as I could be to him, and the only way I knew how to do that was to move up to Lake Superior, which was a shared love of ours. And so I did. And I lived off-grid in a cabin, a very small cabin. I arrived January 4th. It was minus 14 degrees before the wind chill. I had never chopped wood before. So I lived there for 2 winters, and that's also part of the story. But then eventually, my grandparents, who were still living in Gad, reached their 92nd year. And they would pass within a month of each other. And this is the story, or part of the bit that I write about my grandfather's end of life. In the aftermath of Grandma's death, there were no cookies left in the cookie jar. No bread was baked. No greeble soup made. No beef roast or gravy or mashed potatoes peeled by her hands. There was ham. She wanted ham at her funeral luncheon. Grandma loved a good piece of pork. She'd grown up raising pigs. After her funeral, there was plenty of ham. We ate her ham like a sacrament. Then we froze the rest. My grandma refused to have a pacemaker put in. She said she was ready. It took 2 weeks. She left her body on the 6th of August, not the 4th. That was her 73rd wedding anniversary. Not the 5th. That was my 48th birthday. But on the 6th, her very own death day. Sympathy cards filled the mailbox. They stacked up like pancakes on the dining room table. In the hot afternoons, I would make lunch for Grandpa. Maybe leftovers, maybe pan-fried walleye from my uncle's recent trip to Canada fishing. After lunch, maybe we'd play a game or two of cribbage. Eventually, like the sun seeks the western horizon, he would return to his reclining chair that smelled of urine to nap. My grandpa knew how to work, and he knew how to nap. Some days I would ask him if he wanted me to read the sympathy cards. He gave me the nod. And I would pull 5 or 6 from the pile and read. These days his eyes always looked red and sore, like they were burning to cry. As I read, sometimes tears squeezed out, leaving polka dots on his dark shirt. Sometimes he chuckled at a kindly written note, perhaps detailing a memory of his wife and him. And sometimes he'd elaborate on that story, his eyes 100 years away. He took every kind word in those cards and let every heartfelt condolence sink into his crusty, quadruple bypassed old heart. So did I. Those were poignant days in the aftermath, without her singing, rising up from the stove. Without her, their home place of 72 years was something other. Together, Grandpa and I were broken open in her absence. And while we read cards, crying and laughing and soaking in the ocean of it all, my mom, their daughter, Lorna, took her grief to the garden to pull weeds. I'll stop there. There's more. So, let's see, what's next? So then I moved to Lake Superior, and I had an axe that I inherited from my dad, which was convenient because I would have to chop wood if I wanted to heat that cabin. And like I said, I had never used an axe. And I'll just read a few paragraphs about that arrival. So on this January day, I drove north with my dad's iron-headed axe, perpetually red-rimmed eyes, and a black bag filled with more grief than I knew what to do with. First, Venus, who was a beloved cat who lived with me here in Fairfield, who died on D Street, then my dad, and now Mike. I was heading north and off the map with questions so thick in my mind they seemed to sometimes hunt the wind, seeking answers. And strangely, there was grace or what I call grace, this larger, deeper, flowing, interdependent connection that I was just a small part of. This grace, an awareness of Source, God, the unified field, slipped in slantwise under the blanket of the star-salted night, or along the liminal space where sandstone met a great inland sea. And there, with a lung full of indigo at the edge of my world, all the questions fell away. I arrived, and all around, blue-hued lake effect snow shrouded everything. And there, set in that pure white, sat the cabin, 400 square feet, 30 years old, hand-built, and uninsulated. It had a wood stove. There was no running water. I was home. So, 2 winters I lived in that extraordinary cabin, 5 miles from the largest freshwater lake in the world, a lake that holds 1/10 of the fresh water supply. And grace continued to show up, deep experiences, deep interconnection with nature sort of fueled my life. My life swung between the frozen outside and the fire inside. I'd have to wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning every night until spring to feed the fire. I chopped wood and I carried water. And the following spring, I had I heard that there was a band playing at one of the local colleges about 6 miles away. And the band's name was Duck for the Oyster. It was March. There was still plenty of snow on the ground. It was a Friday night, and part of me wanted to go. Part of me wanted to go and stand in the door, listening to the music and letting whatever needed to flow and fall. That night, I didn't go, but I wrote a story. And that story was the first, other than the journal entries that I pulled from, my journal, that have been, kind of supported for print. That story was the first story that I wrote. And it was the beginning. It was like that was the uncracking of this process to write, to feel, to write, to keep myself moderately sane. So this is a piece from that first piece called A Story for the Band. If I go to the dance, I'll catch the band on break and say, "Hey, you don't recognize me, but I was the rainbow dancing in the arms of the priest at the Halloween dance last Halloween. I wanted to thank you for giving us one of the best and life-altering nights of our year, of our life." I'd take a deep breath, pausing and looking into their still listening eyes. The fiddle player would nod for me to go on. And I'd share a story. "After we left the dance," I said, "we drove through the bruised black night back to Springbrook, sharing childhood ghost stories. All Hallows Eve, the night when otherworldliness rules. The night, according to the Celts, is the beginning of winter and the dark side of the year begins. Back at Mike's home in the wild woods, we made chamomile tea that sat cooling on the counter while we made sweet love in the arms of the gods in a tattered velour chair. The fiddle player will lean in. The guitar player will look at their watch. With my eyes lit bright, I'll continue. Afterwards, we spooned and nuzzled, glowing, purring into each other and sipping the tepid tea. I told him my transcendental meditation story. He told me I should have won the prize for the best costume. He actually did. And I said, oh, I won the prize. You. I felt his soft heart swell like a full cat's belly. That night we were falling in love, humming with it. Love in the food we prepared for each other, the costumes we adorned for each other. Love with each step danced, eyes softly held. Each caress and each kiss. It was easy to fall. I was letting go of such weight from my dad's recent death, and Mike was preparing to let go of the weight of a lifetime. A poem. So intermingled in here are some poems. And so many of these poems just sort of really fell right out of wherever poetry falls from and landed. It's called What Fell from the Moon Last Night. What fell from the moon last night? The peace behind everything is the unstory. Beneath us all is the emptiness we forget and remember. The unknown on the horizon is the place we seek and hide from, is the endless sky well of mystery we drink from. The bright chord of wonder within is where all is born and dies from, is the fertile, dark, and white feral thread, is the peace and the mystery and the only way in and out. So then after my time up north in the cabin, time passed as it does, and I fell in love again. I felt like it was important. Maybe it was because I hadn't known Mike long. It wasn't a long relationship. But about 8 months after, I fell in love with a lovely human who is still my partner. And we had a long-distance relationship. And for a year, me way up in the cabin, him down in a place called Menominee on the shores of Lake Menomin, this reservoir that I shared earlier. And it was while I was living there that my grandparents both passed away, and another layer of deep grief was processed. And another deeper layer of grace, another deeper layer of interconnection with the more than human world. That is not my phrase. It was coined by a philosopher whose name was David Abrams. Incredible writer. So I'm going to read this, and it's going to be the last piece I read, I think. And we'll save Scotland for another time, or you can explore it yourself. Because this is pretty apt, and I don't know if any of you have seen pictures of folks in New York this week of the skyline And I know that it's impacted the air quality here, these raging wildfires up in Canada. Well, back in 2016, there was a fire as well in Alberta. And I wrote this poem about my experience. It's called Communion of Subjects, honoring the losses of Alberta's Fort McMurray wildfire. 10,000 spirits wrapped in summer clouds, ushered by the northwest wind, came softly after such brutal raging, after the 1,000-mile journey dusted in stars, drifting in through the night-washed window, an incense of lost and found, a 3 a.m. waking while the world around slept. For days, the veil of ghosts draped over maples, wrapped round lampposts, occluding even the sun. The mighty, smoky remains of jack pine, spruce, tracks of needle and thread grass, beaks and bone, all ash. Burnt offerings in my lungs, both foreign and known, consumed, consummate, a sorrow, a loss. The sublimation of a living world, now falling ash, effortless as snow over the taiga, dispersed by the wide white wings of Saskatoon swans, digested by frog spawn dining in Lake Manitoba, and compost for the lady slipper's threaded roots. Who says there isn't enchantment in ashes? Where is the story behind God? So, yeah, thank you.